I don't doubt that you've played any of the highly regarded Batman Arkham games. You've probably even played the lesser discussed predecessor, Batman Begins. Hell, what about the tightly designed classic, Batman on NES? The Dark Knight surely has no shortage of video games. But have you ever played any of his Java games? Yep, it's one of those videos again. So, reach into your utility belt and crack open that dusty old flip phone. We're going through all of Batman's Java games. I have a bunch of other videos where I cover forgotten mobile games like The Dark Knight Rises, and others for just about every Spider-Man mobile game there's ever been. If this is the kind of thing that interests you, why not give a like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know which mobile game you'd like to see me cover in the future. I also have a YouTube membership you can join with perks like channel emotes, early access to videos, and shoutouts at the end of each one. Any and all kinds of support is greatly appreciated. Now back to the video. Our run through these mobile games very fittingly begins with Batman Begins. I really admired what they were going for here. Developer Clear Games went for a stealth-focused approach that, while it doesn't manage to make the most out of the genre, I still think it's an inspired decision, more so than just going for a straightforward beat-em-up. A stealth game in the 2D perspective is certainly unconventional and may seem a bit restrictive when compared to how much more space and variables you have to deal with in a 3D game, but it can still be done. Just take a look at the fantastic Mark of the Ninja, which is a game I consider to be one of the best stealth games out there. Batman Begins doesn't implement elements like light and sound into a stealth-based gameplay loop though. The main way you'll be avoiding enemies is simply by ducking behind crates and generally avoiding their line of sight by climbing onto other platforms. There's this aggression meter that fills up the longer you stay exposed to enemies. The more it's filled up, the more alert enemies will be, which means they'll survey their posts more frequently. If you carelessly persist to make your presence known to enemies, the aggression meter will fill to the brim and that'll result in a fail state. This could have been the key factor in making this game an engaging experience. The problem is that you really have to try to get that fail state. The aggression meter is far too forgiving to offer any kind of challenge. The idea should be to always have to take enemies out with a stealth takedown, which you can do, but it's not really necessary. You can engage with most enemies head on and repeatedly punch them until they're knocked out well before having to worry about the aggression meter reaching its capacity. To make matters even easier, taking the next enemy out with a stealth takedown will reduce the aggression meter back a couple notches. So you never really have to put in that much effort into being stealthy. And it's such a shame because the foundation for a somewhat engaging 2D stealth game is here. You can use a flashbang grenade to stun multiple enemies, thus allowing you to quickly scurry past them. Gliding down from above and quickly taking out an enemy with a single kick is effective, feels satisfying, and is just a very classic Batman thing to do. I even love how this game takes a page from Batman Vengeance with how enemies can get back up unless you handcuff them. Granted, this game gives you unlimited handcuffs, and I think it would have been more interesting if you had a limited supply, so you had to be more selective about the goons you decide to cuff. Like cuffing one in a spot you have to backtrack in, or one in a tricky platforming spot that you might fail a few times, so you won't have to keep dealing with him. There were some other classic stealth level design moments, like having to keep an eye out for enemy silhouettes in windows and waiting for them to go away before walking by. But again, the game's overly forgiving alert system makes these moments trivial. Even though the game never posed a challenge, I did think the level design was solid, with some light platforming, some simple environmental interactions like throwing batarangs at ladders to knock them down, and gliding across wide gaps is always fun. Strangely enough, the game only takes place during the dock sequence of the movie. You know, the one where Batman tracks down Falcone during that whole drug operation he's running. I don't know why, as the game could have included some levels where you have to go up against League of Shadow Ninjas that posed a greater challenge, or maybe a level where you had to sneak through Arkham Asylum and avoid some guards. But no, the game ends with an incredibly underwhelming boss fight against Falcone, where all I had to do was bum rush him and beat him to a pulp. So, not a promising start for Batman Java games. Again, a cool idea for what I imagine was supposed to be a stealth-focused game, but unfortunately, it just didn't stick the landing. Before continuing with the Nolan-based games, let's get a little more kid-friendly and check out LEGO Batman. The LEGO games were a huge part of my childhood. I spent countless hours playing the LEGO Star Wars games on PS2 with my little brother. We'd track down all the mini-kits, fill up the stud meter to reach Jedi Master status, and replay the Mustafar level where we'd battle each other as Anakin and Obi-Wan. The core gameplay of the LEGO games consists of beating up enemies with a simple combat system, breaking every single piece of furniture in sight for stud pieces, and assembling LEGO constructions to unlock the next part of the level. It's a simple formula, but it makes for a fun cooperative experience that clearly worked, as there have been countless LEGO games. LEGO Batman for mobile devices boils down the experience to a simple brawler with the occasional environmental puzzle. But calling these environmental puzzles is a bit generous, as all you have to do most of the time is use the remnants of a destroyed LEGO piece to build a ladder, a switch, or bomb to put in a specific spot that'll destroy some sort of obstacle. Still, it is nice to have some structure and simple goals amidst the constant barrage of enemies to pummel. The combat system is very bare bones. You can do certain inputs for different attacks like a leg sweep, but there's very little reason to do so, as the simple punch combo is more than enough to take out anyone daring enough to face you. There are some special segments that break up the formula a bit, like this very brief turret section, and most notably a couple of dedicated Batmobile levels. These are also just very basic. You'll ride along a highway as you avoid obstacles, fire away at enemy vehicles, and drop bombs to take out a massive truck tailgating you. I wish I appreciated these Batmobile sections a bit more, as they do offer something different, but frankly, they're just really boring and I couldn't wait for them to be over, so I could just go back to the standard beat 'em up levels. One of the most charming aspects of the older LEGO games was their unique style of humor. Back then, LEGO games were devoid of dialogue and instead delivered the story by having characters mime what they were trying to say, and generally just be really expressive with their bodies. I love that kind of humor in the old LEGO games, and I would look forward to seeing how they would interpret famous scenes from movies, like the iconic twist from Empire. In the LEGO interpretation, Vader whips out a family portrait and points it at Luke. I think that's hilarious and super cute. With LEGO Batman on mobile, since it doesn't have the advantage of 3D graphics and more advanced animation, some of the jokes don't come across very clearly, or they'll just be really basic gags like characters running away all scared. The 2D sprites have very limited animations, so there's not much to work with. The story is as straightforward as it gets. Villains are running amok throughout Gotham, causing all sorts of chaos. Like Mr. Freeze robbing a bank, Ivy taking control of plants in a greenhouse, and Joker, well, just being Joker. Boss fights, while never providing the slightest challenge, do have some design to them. They'll do a very basic attack pattern that you have to dodge as you wait for an opening, like Mr. Freeze reloading his ice gun. The ending to this game is one of the most abrupt ones I've ever seen. You take down the Joker, then the game just hard cuts to superhero mode unlocked. Wanna play again? No? Then get the fuck out of here. Well, not so fast. There are a few things to do after you beat the game, like running it again in the aforementioned harder difficulty, superhero mode, and you can also continue to rack up studs to purchase these little puzzles you can put together. That's nice. LEGO Batman is pretty much a run-of-the-mill beat-em-up. I think it could have done a bit more to translate the versatility that comes with playing around with LEGO pieces by having Batman build more varied and wacky constructs than just the constant bomb and switches you have to pull. There's also a different version of this game to play on less advanced cell phones, but it's pretty much the same experience with less detailed sprites. Let's move on to the next game, The Dark Knight. I always find the idea of a video game adaptation of specifically The Dark Knight to be so fascinating. It's just so weird to me. Not to sound pretentious, but I've always seen The Dark Knight as a movie that's above a video game adaptation. Like, I can absolutely understand a video game tie-in for something like Ghost Rider or The Incredible Hulk, but The Dark Knight feels like such a more adult movie that a tie-in video game just doesn't seem appropriate. Like, I've always found it so funny that there's a PS2 Sopranos and The Godfather video games. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the fact that there is, and this isn't meant to degrade those video games, as any type of story can be told through the medium. Anyway, this makes this the only Dark Knight video game adaptation, unless there's some online Flash game I don't know about, and thus the only place where you can find a video game iteration of Heath Ledger's Joker. This is yet another 2D brawler that tells a very abridged version of the movie's story. The combat system is simple, but even in its simplicity is able to have a bit of depth and actually feels really fluid. Engaging with enemies has Batman automatically lunge toward them, much like he does in the Arkham games, and throwing punches has a nice snappy feel to them that are coupled with smooth animations. You have a couple different attacks you can pull off, like your standard punch combo, a grab, leg sweep, and perform takedowns on stunned enemies. The game makes the most of these different attacks by having enemies block certain ones. So you have to do a bit of experimenting when a thug is being stubborn and not submitting to your blows. You can also block attacks, which can cause certain enemies to get stunned and leave them open for a counter. Again, you don't have the most extensive array of abilities, but when the occasional thug requires more than just mindlessly pressing the attack button, it goes a long way. You also have some stealth takedowns you can do by approaching enemies from behind, but the game doesn't really present many opportunities to use these, and even when there are opportunities for stealth, it's not really a necessity. You can zip up street lamps and lure enemies below by tossing a batarang to get their attention, then swoop down for a takedown. There are also these doorways you can hide in, and the sprite work for Batman hiding in the shadows goes absolutely crazy. Look at this is so cool. You can also swoop out of here for a stealth takedown, but again, the game just doesn't utilize these stealth abilities to their potential. It would have been cool to have some completely stealth dedicated levels that have enemies with high powered weapons that can take Batman out in just a single shot to really make the most of these features. I did find it strange that the game doesn't let you drop down to platforms below you, since there were a couple times that I was perfectly set up to take an enemy out stealthily. But he was below me and I couldn't jump down unless I would just advance forward to look for an opening, to then come down and then double back to where the enemy was. And at that point I figured, what's the point? Why not just keep pressing forward? It's not like there's any real incentive to take the enemy out. There is one level that requires you to sneak up on an enemy by using your grapple gun to go up platforms and then tuck into these shadowy doorways, and it's actually a boss fight against Scarecrow. And, well, even though I got what I wished for in a certain shape or form, this stealth-oriented encounter with Scarecrow feels a little jank. You're supposed to lure him to one of these shadowy spots so you can leap out and grab him, but I could never really gauge his movement pattern and how exactly it is that I was supposed to lure him. If you approach him head-on, he'll spray you with fear gas, so obviously that's a no-go. Eventually, I was able to tuck away in one of these spots, and he did conveniently walk past it, so I was able to jump out at him, but I don't know what I did to cause that. I feel like I brute forced my way through the boss fight, but I guess whatever works. Most of the levels are pretty straightforward, but you do have a couple that have specific objectives, like some that have you searching every inch of the stage for a certain number of bombs. They even shake up the formula a little bit when it comes to level design, like this one level that has a strong emphasis on verticality as you work your way up this skyscraper by using your grapple gun and cape to glide across large gaps. Swinging around actually has some momentum to it, and it feels pretty good. It's never used in a way that challenges the player to use that aspect as a way to clear obstacles though. At the very least, I wish you could take fall damage as a risk-reward thing. Like, quickly make your way through the level and avoid enemy encounters with these, really large grapple swings, but at the risk of eating shit like old Battinson over here. The final level of the game is a boss fight against the Joker, and I thought it was designed pretty well. He'll send out two of his hired thugs, and I found these guys to simultaneously be the most offensive and defensive of the thugs I've come across. I guess those tryouts really do weed out the weak. Once you take out the thugs, the Joker will toss a handful of grenades, and they have this small opening that you can dodge him in. Once you do that, he'll come down to your level where he'll attempt to shoot you. Once you avoid his shot, this is your opportunity to lunge at him and do some direct damage. And he can take quite the punch, so you'll be repeating this pattern for a little bit, which to me is okay because this boss fight pattern has a very old school feel to it. It's easy to pick up on the pattern, but if you're not paying attention, you can easily mess up and take some significant damage. Aesthetically, it actually reminds me of the boss fight against the Joker in Batman for NES. The way that it's this simple stage and how the Joker pulls out a gun on you. I was hoping for a surprise boss fight against Two-Face, but I suppose that was an unrealistic expectation from me since the game had not even mentioned his name at this point. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, if you haven't noticed, the best jar file I could find for this game happened to be in Spanish. Spanish is my first language, so I had no problem reading the text, but the game doesn't bother translating the characters' names to Spanish. To be fair, El Hombre Murciélago doesn't roll off the tongue as well as Batman, and you also get gems like this. El Joker. So, unfortunately, as the only video game based on The Dark Knight, it doesn't really offer anything substantial. But it is a competent 2D beat 'em up that honestly could have been a lot worse. The next game, however, absolutely floored me. Why the hell didn't anyone tell me that the Dark Knight Rises 2D game by Gameloft absolutely rules? This game is really good and I've never heard anyone utter a word about it. It's fun, it's always introducing something new in each level, the graphics look beautiful, and it just has so much going for it that it genuinely caught me off guard. I can't describe it better than simply it feels like the developers didn't just see this as a soulless cash grab and actually put in some effort to make a fun game that's worth your time. The way the game opened, it immediately hooked me. You're platforming through the rooftops of Gotham using wall jumps, wall slides, and using your grapple gun to zip up to elevated platforms. All in a way that's presented really well with these badass animations and graphics that really pop. Levels are designed in a way that is always making use of all of Batman's abilities, so they never feel stale and are paced out really well. I really love this set piece early on in the game. You're chasing after some guy and you go from wall jumping to gliding across a large gap as you avoid spotlights to not get shot. Then you're sliding down these two walls as you jump between them to avoid these electrical boxes. And finally, it ends with Batman dive bombing to catch the goon with a simple QuickTime event. And this whole section just impressed me with its display of badass subsequent feats you gotta pull off, with this general vibe of cinematic flair, even though it's just a 2D game. Platforming is not precision-based or challenging by any means, but Batman does feel good to control. He has a bit of a weighty feel when he jumps, and doing the more elaborate platforming sections like wall sliding and wall jumping makes levels feel engaging. Like, check out this section that has Batman go from sliding down this collapsed floor to then zipping up to a pipe that suddenly falls apart, to then gliding for a bit, and then finally wall sliding down a pit of flaming walls. This is one continuous section, and that's pretty much the format most levels follow. There's hardly ever a dull moment. Combat is simple, but feels really good with responsive controls and these slow wind-up animations for finishing blows that, whenever Batman connects with them, it gives them a really strong impact. You can also counter attacks by pressing the punch button whenever you see this lightning bolt icon that I'm sure is no coincidence that it resembles the counter prompt from the Arkham games. The window for these can be a little tricky to nail, but doing so feels really good with this screen shake effect. And seeing Batman slam a thug on his ass just never gets old. You can also dodge attacks by double tapping the directional button toward the enemy, making Batman reposition himself behind them. This one's a little finicky. Often I would double tap to dodge and Batman would do the dodge animation, but he wouldn't end up behind the enemy. He would just weirdly turn his back towards his opponents and push up against them, leaving himself open to attacks. When it does work the way it's supposed to, it's another ability that feels really good to use. Even though there's not an extensive list of combat moves you can do, giving me the option to block, counter, and dodge attacks is already a lot more than I was expecting. Not to mention the takedowns and double takedowns you can do when ambushing enemies from above. There's never any emphasis on sneaking around, you'll never come across a fully dedicated stealth level, but you can throw batarangs at light bulbs to distract conveniently placed enemies and put them in the darkness where you can do a one-hit takedown. There are a few instances where goons will be holding up hostages at gunpoint, and getting caught while this is going on will result in the innocent civilians getting shot. These were very few and far between, I think it happens only twice, but it was just another element in levels that kept things fresh during the game's short runtime. Gadgets are another part of Batman that this game just doesn't implement a whole lot of, but there are a few spots where you have to use a remote batarang to take out a junction box or something like that. I thought those were cool, but I wish the mazes you had to go through were a little longer and challenging, just to make the most out of the few parts where you do have to use the remote batarang. Adding a twist to the traditional gameplay, you have levels that are vehicle-based ones, and ones where you play as Catwoman. The Catwoman ones are a take on that Vector game. You remember that one? It's an automatic runner where you swipe up to either jump over incoming obstacles and gaps, or swipe down to slide underneath them. I thought this game was awesome back in the day, with its impressive lifelike animations and just how smooth the player character would transition between animations. I hadn't played anything else like it on the phone at the time. Well, the Catwoman's levels adapt that gameplay style, but just not as good. The animations don't look as good, and her actions don't feel as responsive. The vehicle sections on the Batpod are okay. They're a bit too frantic to make me feel like I have any real control over what's happening. The way these top-down levels are laid out make it feel like you're just being funneled through the level. They're also pretty reserved when it comes to decreasing your health bar for running into obstacles. Like, I swear I'm running into everything in my path, but I'm not taking the damage I expect. The Batpod is equipped with these cannons, and oh my god, Batman just spun the Batpod around to shoot at enemies behind him while driving in reverse. This game is awesome. But yeah, the real highlight of this game are the traditional side-scrolling levels because oh my god, Batman just ditched the Batpod in the middle of a rooftop and is now gliding around the city using the grapple gun to shoot at lampposts to propel himself forward. This game is awesome. Much like The Dark Knight, this is an abridged version of the movie's plot. I was hoping that it would have a level where you have to climb your way out of the Lazarus Pit as a raggedy Bruce Wayne, much like the 3D Gameloft Dark Knight Rises game, but that plot point of the movie gets brushed by pretty quickly. There are a couple boss fights against Bane, and they're pretty good, but the one that goes super hard is the last one. Very fittingly. It puts the 3D Dark Knight Rises final boss fight to shame. The boss fight starts with Bane and Batman falling down this pit, then they both start wall sliding down as Bane chucks grenades at you, and then you finally reach the ground and this is where the fight begins. But this little opening section is so over the top when compared to the grounded approach the Nolan movies take, but goddamn do I love it. The rest of the fight is straightforward. You stay out of the way of Bane's grenades and dodge his punches to then counter him with your own. When you beat the game, you still have a couple of extra tasks to check off the list if your heart desires. You can collect the gold bat coins scattered throughout the levels, and complete achievements like beating a level without taking too much damage. These unlock bonus gadgets like this little sonar doodad that lets you know how many bat coins you have left to collect in the current level, and boots that increase Batman's running speed. If you couldn't tell, I was really impressed with The Dark Knight Rises here. This is what I love about checking out these lesser discussed Java games. You'd be surprised with the gems you come across. Most of the time, these games can be beaten in just around an hour, and if they were able to extend these games to at least being 2.5 hours long, this would 100% be on par with something you'd play on GBA. Next up is Superman and Batman Heroes United. Just because it's a world's finest game, it doesn't mean that I'm not gonna include it in a video about Batman Java games. In this game, Superman and Batman take on parademons invading Metropolis through boom tubes in a 2D brawler that comes so close to being a game I like but just misses the mark. You have these beautifully crafted sprites that absolutely nail the comic book aesthetic with how colorful they are and how they're shaded. Their animations are the most exaggerated and dynamic of the games I've played so far. It all looks very Jim Lee inspired. Despite the game looking really good, the gameplay itself just feels like it lacks substance. Combat feels really floaty and is devoid of any satisfying feedback. There are a few different attacks you can do as each hero. Batman has a basic punch combo and this kick attack that knocks enemies back. He can throw batarangs and bombs as his special abilities that are tied to this blue meter below his health bar. These were definitely the best implementation of gadgets because of how ingrained they feel to combat. Throwing batarangs or bombs feels really responsive and fast, though a little too fast when it comes to batarangs to the point where it can feel exploitative and starts to break the throwing animation. Defeating enemies will eventually allow you to call in an assist from your super pal, and he'll do an attack that clears the screen of any enemies in sight. Superman comes in with a massive heat vision attack, and Batman flies in with a carpet bomb from his Batwing. Superman's levels have him flying around all the time, and can I just say that this is a huge nitpick of mine when it comes to Superman in video games? Even when they do it in fighting games, I get that it makes sense for this godlike being to be perpetually in flight, since it's an ability that's so second nature to him and for sure provides more mobility, but I don't know, man, let me decide whether I want to fly or not. Anyway, the issues I had with Batman's hand-to-hand combat carry over to Superman in the way that they just lack any sense of impact or punchiness. But they're made a bit more frustrating because Superman's punches tend to knock enemies back a bit, so I had to reposition myself in front of the enemy often so I can connect my attacks. But I gotta say, his special abilities come pretty close to making up for the limp melee combat. Freezing an enemy using the Ice Breath, then following up with a Heat Vision attack is super satisfying. Level design is another aspect of the game that feels really uninspired. The same two backgrounds are used over and over, save for like the last two levels. And while they're another visual element that looks very comic booky, with how gray and gothic these buildings look with their gargoyles being very appropriate for a Gotham setting, then having these bright and sunny Metropolis levels, the contrast is really appreciated. But when it's just these two visual themes for 90% of the game, it just starts to feel very samey and dull. The actual structure of the levels leave a lot to be desired too. Most of the time you're doing very basic objectives like defeat 20 parademons or destroy 8 of these egg looking things. This is the type of thing you'll be doing throughout the game, which gives the whole experience a cookie cutter feel. This is something that really bugged me. These laser obstacles feel so lazy as a way to give the level a sense of structure. They feel like they're in place of something that could feel as a more natural part of the level. They're so generic and are another element that's found in every stage. The green lasers are always there and will instantly do damage, whereas the orange lasers are set off by a timer whenever you cross them. So whenever you see an orange laser, that's where you want to go. I don't like that these lasers feel like a crutch for engaging level design, because when it comes to navigating the stage, specifically as Batman, it feels pretty good. You have to utilize your grapple gun to get around and reach higher platforms, or drop down to lower platforms to circumvent green lasers. In a later level, there was a surprisingly almost tricky platforming bit where you had to drop down to a lower platform, then quickly zip up before hitting the out-of-bounds bottomless pit that would instantly kill you. And I thought that was a hint at the potential this game has when it comes to somewhat challenging or at least quasi-engaging gameplay. I just wish they shook things up a bit with levels that perhaps took place indoors or at street level, or shoot, I'd even take the mandatory sewer level that's in almost every comic book game. The game has just two villains to fight, that being Metallo and Darkseid, and I thought they were serviceable boss fights. I came across an exploit in the Metallo fight that made the encounter just trivial, but you know, the idea of an engaging boss fight with attack patterns and all that was there. It's not my fault that I'm just too damn good of a gamer. The Darkseid fight at least fared a bit better, but really the highlight of the game is the relationship between Batman and Superman. Their dialogue is really well written, with these really wholesome moments to have them being just so supportive of each other. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough for me to enjoy my time with Superman and Batman's Heroes United. I really needed more interesting levels to play through and melee attacks that didn't feel like I was slapping enemies with a wet noodle. Batman Guardian of Gotham. Here's a game that when I booted it up and realized what kind of game it was, I was in utter disappointment. A sort of first-person shooter where you throw batarangs at thugs and what's just essentially a shooting gallery. No movement, no puzzles, no platforming, just this. But in one of the fastest turnarounds I've experienced in my life, little did I expect that this would end up being one of my favorite games on this list. Batman Guardian of Gotham is indeed just a first-person shooter, but it focuses on that vision so much that it does it really well. With challenging levels, varied and interesting enemies that require different tactics when it comes to taking them down, and a gameplay loop that asks you to really pay attention and be smart about which enemies you choose to engage first. Every level will present you with a singular screen and enemies will come pouring in, each that have specific tells to let you know when they're about to attack. They'll shoot at you, throw knives and grenades, and your goal is to juggle these enemies when the game gets to the point where it starts throwing an overwhelming amount of them, with some that require multiple steps to take down. At first, you'll get standard thugs that can be taken out with a single batarang. Smack them in the face before they get a chance to shoot at you or toss a knife, and they'll cowardly run away. If they do get the chance to chuck a knife at you, you still have a generous window before it reaches you, and you can smack it out of the air with a batarang. Things get trickier when you have multiple enemy types on screen, so if a goon throws a knife at you and then another just telegraphs that he's about to shoot you with his gun, well, a bullet travels faster than a tossed knife, so it's in your best interest to take out the guy with the gun, even though the knife is in mid-flight. If you time it right, you'll be able to take out the guy with the gun and smack the knife out of the sky before it hits you. This is pretty much the gameplay loop of the game. Things will just keep ramping up in difficulty by introducing tougher enemies. For example, there are guys that have to be hit multiple times and be stunned to then tie them up with a rope. This takes a bit of time as you have to fill up this meter before Batsy zips on over and subdues the thug. So again, you'll have to prioritize by threat level, since filling up this meter will have your hands tied up for a few moments and potentially leave you open to attacks. You also come across some of Batman's rogues like Two-Face and Joker, and I was surprised by how much of an engaging boss fight they managed to be despite this odd gameplay style. They also have tells that cue you in as to when is the proper time to attack them. For Two-Face, you have to strike his coin with a batarang whenever he tosses it into the air, which causes him to completely lose sense of reality. The Joker was actually a really tough boss fight. He tosses playing cards at you and you have to do this tricky shot where you time your next button press as soon as you hit a card with your batarang to bounce it off the card and then onto him. You can also do this to regular enemies as a sort of combo mechanic, but it is absolutely needed to beat the Joker, because he's completely immune to just tossing a batarang straight at him. I must have had to try this fight at least 5 times, and it was pretty frustrating because when you lose, you have to start at the beginning of the stage and have to work your way to the boss fight. While we don't get to see Batman himself all that often in this game, except when he zips in to tie up a bad guy, I gotta say, his sprite looks really cool. It's another one that just looks very comic booky, and it's my favorite version of the Batsuit. I love the gray and blue combo. All we see of him is his right arm most of the time, and even that one appendage manages to evoke a very strong comic book aesthetic with that thick white outline and shading. Guardian of Gotham is just a pure, unadulterated video game. Its mechanics and gameplay loop are so well refined. I get the feeling that a lot of people would be deterred from this game because it's a little unconventional and not just another 2D brawler, but it would be criminal to disregard this game because of that. And well, you know what Batman does to criminals. Where am I? Come here. So that's every Batman Java game. If you have any ideas for another collection of Java games on a particular character you'd like to see me cover, shout it out in the comments. Special thanks to Sam, Carlos, and the Minor Prophet for joining my membership at the top tier. You guys are certified superheroes. Thanks for watching, and shit, I forgot Batman Puzzle Mania!